So yeah, I was going to give you a bit of an introductory overview on how the coronavirus situation has impacted our surveillance schemes. So as we're all aware, the situation this year has been unprecedented in terms of the intense restrictions put on people because of a pandemic. Our monitoring and recording schemes are dependent on volunteers going out and doing field work. So when we were all instructed to stay at home, obviously this has had really big implications for our schemes. It was important for us to present a clear and at times unpopular message to volunteers, as we had to tell them to stop taking part, at least on a temporary basis. From the start, we have been clear that it's essential to prioritise safety and follow government rules and guidelines in the different country. It is worth noting, though, that it's not entirely unprecedented to have restrictions on access to the countryside that impact our schemes. So in 2001, there was the foot and mouth outbreak, and there were widespread restrictions to stop the spread in livestock. So we use this as an example to try and reassure our volunteers that losing some data would not be detrimental to our schemes in the long term. But communicating the implications of the coronavirus situation to our volunteers hasn't been totally straightforward, particularly as the situation has changed really quickly with little notice, and especially also as the guidance in the different countries of the UK has diverged. Bearing in mind the challenges, we have been really pleased with how quickly and effectively scheme partners have kept volunteers updated with the changing situation. For example, I was just looking at the UK BMS website as I was preparing this presentation, and note there have been a total of 9 updates so far informing volunteers of what the situation means for them for their recording. We were also keen to have a joined up approach across schemes as much as possible in our communication. And we were really grateful for James Pearce Higgins at BTO for setting up virtual meetings for different organisations to come together and discuss the situation. This involved a very wide range of NGOs, including those representing schemes beyond our TEPoP family. So it was really useful to get a wide perspective on the issue. As I know some of the people who were joining those meetings from beyond our TEPoP family are also able to join us today, so we're really pleased about that. So welcome. So how have our schemes been affected in terms of the amount of data submitted? Well, I did email around scheme organisers asking for some data on this, but it wasn't quite as straightforward to summarise and produce a useful comparison as I initially hoped, as often volunteers don't submit their records until the end of the season. However, obviously there were major reductions in the amount of surveying that took place after lockdown was announced in the spring. This has been really clear across schemes that where the recording season is at that time of year. This example graph is from the Wetland bird survey that Teresa kindly gave me, showing the amount of data submitted by the same dates throughout the year for this year and last. So it's a like for like comparison, although not completely reflective of the final numbers. The core season for web surveying is over the winter period, so the scheme was not as seriously affected as most of the other schemes, although recorders are still encouraged to carry on with their surveys over the summer. And you can see from the graph, there's a dramatic reduction in data submissions immediately after lockdown was announced, but it gradually built back to normal over the following months. The breeding bird survey was probably one of the most affected schemes, with very few of the first of the 2 annual survey visits occurring. I think nest recording was also heavily impacted. For butterflies, the start of the sample season was impacted, but thankfully the virus levels had reduced and restrictions had eased by the main part of the summer. So most of the wider countryside butterfly survey recording was still able to go ahead. There were differences between countries, with counts taking an extra week or 2 to build up in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and in Wales they remained limited, although growing, right up until the start of July. Some of our schemes were still able to partially continue at the height of lockdown. For example, the pollinator monitoring scheme has an aspect called flower insect timed counts, and these were able to carry on going in people's gardens. For bird ringing, constant effort sites could be set up in gardens. And for the National Bat Monitoring Programme, the entry-level sunrise to sunset survey can take place in people's gardens, and also roost counts people can do on their own properties. So Obviously, the reductions in data that we have had across our schemes impacts the analyses that we can do. And Dawn is going to talk to us about this later, and there'll be an opportunity to discuss the implications across all of our schemes in the breakout group we have coming up. Another impact on our partners relates to funding and organisational security. Many conservation NGOs get some of their income from visitors coming to nature reserves, and this obviously had to stop over lockdown. And as many people have experienced job losses or reduced incomes, they have sometimes reduced their charitable donations too. Almost all of our partners have had to furlough at least some of their members of staff for a while. Finances to run our surveillance schemes have actually been tight for a long time, so new resource concerns for NGOs adds to an already challenging situation. This graph shows the amount of funding that JNCC have been able to put into our terrestrial evidence programme over the last decade or so. Whilst we have prioritised support of our surveillance schemes and we have had some great successes, we have not always been able to do everything that we would have liked, and overall funding has not been keeping up with inflation, as you can see. The current situation has prompted everybody involved in schemes to raise more awareness of the need for extra resource to support schemes. For example, BTO's cross-NGO group wrote a joint open letter to government, and JNCC released a blog post on the importance of surveillance schemes and the need to fully resource them. I'd like to finish this overview by highlighting that in the midst of this really difficult situation, there have been some positives for our schemes. There have been opinion polls conducted showing that lockdown has increased people's appreciation of or engagement with nature. For example, a poll commissioned by the RSPB in May found that 77% agreed that visiting nature had been important for their general health and happiness, and 81% agreed they had felt happier whilst or after spending time visiting nature. Another positive is people's greater familiarity with online communication. For example, at the start of lockdown, I'd never heard of Zoom and very rarely used any video conferencing outside of the odd work meeting. Now, along with many people in the UK, I'm a lot more familiar with using different online communication technologies in a range of situations. This has had real benefits for our schemes, as Rachel's going to tell us about next.
So as Anna has said, I'm planning to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of how the National Plant Monitoring Scheme has built upon our digital engagement with volunteers over the last 5 months in response to the COVID restrictions. So I thought it might be useful to frame some of those risks we identified initially right at the start to MPMS activities as a result of COVID, just really focusing here on our volunteer-specific activities and how we plan to address them. So, of course, as Anna has said, there's concerns around our volunteer surveys, with initially paused survey effort at the start and then reduced survey effort as lockdown eased, and as a result of reduced data submission. Of course, most of us will have seen this and we can expect this, but also as a result, there's a loss of motivation actually and engagement with the scheme. And a really important thing for our volunteers was to be able to provide them with, and continue actually to provide them with clear and regular advice and updates on whether surveys are permitted. And it was clear we were going to need to find a means of alternative engagement. So annually, MPMS has a programme of face-to-face training courses, which are of course cancelled for this season, and the risks of this being the loss of motivation again for volunteers, but also the loss of training and so skills development amongst the volunteer pool. It was clear we needed to review the current materials that we provide and aim to promote these, along with providing new digital training and resources, and also make our regional mentors more visible to volunteers and use social media for training support, so really finding other means. And really to maintain engagement and reduce the impact on motivation and indeed survey square uptake, so thinking about recruitment, it was clear we needed to develop our digital presence and our online community. In terms of our volunteer materials and survey packs, for a significant period, these couldn't be posted to volunteers anymore owing to restrictions and office restrictions. So these needed to be digitised pretty quickly for newcomers, and we really put a focus initially on the tasks and the survey preparations that could still be undertaken under restrictions. So there was still a means of folk getting involved, getting things done and setting up ready for surveys to resume. As I've mentioned, there was a risk that our mentors could not be as active. So along with the digital materials on the website, we really needed to build on our online supporting community, and we plan to hold virtual regional meetings. So, unsurprisingly, the common thread here and the key really was to increase our online and digital presence and support. So for the first time this year, MPMS developed an online training programme, and that spanned 18 weeks through the field season, with weekly training instalments on a variety of themes, and that was housed on the MPMS website. Our volunteers were free to follow the whole programme if they wanted to fully, or to dip in and out depending on the themes that were applicable to their surveys and sites, and also their interests. So of course, we appreciate that these can't replace getting out into the field and actually having a look at these the plants and the habitats, but rather they were really intended as an introduction to the habitats and the species, and to really give the volunteers the understanding and the tools that they need to head out into the field and continue their learning. And as I was saying, these training materials are housed on the online training page. And these include themed presentations, our learning aims and outcomes, as well as supporting materials. And the real aim for these were for them to be publicly available, and also evergreen content, so people can refer back to them and use them as survey aids. And these themes incorporated introduction to MPMS and survey methodology, and also habitat specific training, as well as web and data guidance, so a real range throughout that 18-week programme. Along with these materials on the website, we also ran bookable live events. These weren't public, these were just bookable by MPMS volunteers, registered volunteers with the scheme. So just as a glimpse of these online materials, along with the learning aims and the personal record that the volunteers could keep, our habitat focus presentations, for example, here, included information on, for example, the habitat and its subdivisions. So the example here is the heathland MPMS broad category. The main vascular plant species present, focusing of course on the MPMS indicator species and really the range of floristic variation. And along with those weekly training materials, we provided a document with supporting materials, and that really comprised a comprehensive list of useful book recommendations, for example, useful links, species ID videos, and really references within that weekly theme for any further reading or interest, should the volunteers want any extra information on a particular habitat. As I've mentioned, we also had our weekly Zoom training sessions for volunteer surveyors on each theme each week. And it was lovely to see these lovely smiley faces, especially when we're all feeling particularly isolated, often working from home or stuck at home. And as I say, these were advanced bookings. So these were with a limited number, because we wanted to maintain that training feel and really help conversation. They were about an hour and a half long. And during these, we had a trainer that provided the training presentation, along with some nice questions, some sort of quiz questions throughout to really encourage interaction and really sort of test the learning as we were going along. And then we had question and answer sessions towards the end that tended to focus more on those volunteers' plots and survey sites. So in terms of support, there was obviously always the trainer. There was also always a chair, just to make sure everything was running smoothly and to facilitate asking questions, which we always encouraged our the participants to ask their questions during the chat throughout, the chat facility throughout, as well as doing the question and answer session at the end. And generally, we also had a technical support staff member. So, you know, as Anna said, actually, people started to really get on board with using Zoom, which a lot of us had never even heard of before the lockdown, and they found it as a really nice and user-friendly platform to get on board with the training. We did need to provide joining information and some housekeeping in advance, but I think we all got very used to it very, very quickly. Along with the training sessions and the materials, we also ran a series of data surgeries throughout the training period. These were basically bookable dates where folk could get in touch to ask specific questions, generally around methodology and data. And these were really to be an alternative to our data drop-in sessions that we would have generally liked to have run regionally. MPMS support is always open. We're always open for questions, emails and phone calls, but we find that people, for some reason, maybe we're being a bit British, quite like to have an allocated time where they can get in touch with us. So they worked quite well. We also held a series of regional volunteer meetings, and these were virtual sessions for volunteers to book onto within their area. And in most cases, it provided them the opportunity to speak to a regional mentor along with myself and just meet other volunteers within their area in a COVID secure and informal way. And we've also very much encouraged and seen a lot more activity on our closed MPMS support Facebook group, which has really become quite a hub of volunteer sharing of experience and advice. So for the first time this year, we have run a big MPMS quiz. This was an online quiz that was used alongside the training programme. It was linked with the training programme, and it included quite complementary learning, because as well as just providing a quiz with a score at the end, it included the correct answers and the rationale, how to arrive at those answers. So our volunteers have reported they used it as quite a nice accompaniment to the online training programme. Also, it was good fun. Folk do enjoy a quiz, but it was also very useful for us to use as an initial quality assurance tool. So just in the 3 weeks that it was run, we had over 170 participants involved, and that was from quite a range of surveyor level and experience in terms of the amount of time that they've been with the scheme. But it really helped us to see how our volunteers from different sort of experience levels were getting on with their species ID. And also it helped us to flag potential training gaps, actually where folk were struggling a little bit more. So since the start of lockdown, we've been quite busy. You can see we've been quite busy digitally since around May. And actually, in that time, we have still recruited around 180 new volunteers to the scheme, with 200 MPMS squares being allocated just since the start of lockdown, really. That's quite a large number. That's around 2/3 of our normal annual amount just in the last 5 to 6 months. So we've still managed to engage and recruit quite effectively during this process, and we do think quite a large part of that is owing to the training programme and the additional engagement. During the programme, we ran 14 Zoom sessions altogether with 260 participant places attended. And these participants attended between 1 and 11 sessions, so we could see that some folk really were following the programme right through rather than just dipping in and out. So we had just over 100 unique participants actually. And aside from those Zoom training courses, the training webpage itself, which houses all of our materials, so people who perhaps weren't coming to the training sessions but have been using the materials, has received over 6,500 website hits just since it was launched in mid-May. So it's been really quite popular. So we've got some very early participation feedback. So we've sent out a participant feedback questionnaire towards the end of the training programme. So it's very early days at the moment. We've had some lovely initial feedback from folk really appreciating the ease of access, really, without the need to travel or to commit, a whole days or even multiple days for training courses. They found it a lot easier to get involved. They've quite enjoyed the in-depth look at the different habitats and really gained knowledge in these habitats. We did have some requests for the sessions to be recorded. And also we actually had some difficulty with people booking on, not with the system not working, but because we limited those numbers to the training sessions. The vast majority of them were fully booked within a day of release. So that's been the other feedback, that folk would have liked to have come on to more Zoom sessions, but they couldn't. We also had some really positive feedback on the general materials, actually on the website, folk finding them easy to access and download. They'll plan to continue to use them as survey aids as they continue with their surveys. But again, they've said that it would be nice to have had commentary on the pictures and the presentations that were posted, whether that's via YouTube or a link on the website. And again, as a result of quite a few folk not being able to get onto the Zoom calls, that was again quite a common feedback, is it would have been nice to have had those training courses recorded. So even though it's early days, you can see that the vast majority of people who have responded to the participant survey questionnaire so far have found both the Zoom sessions and the materials provided on the website to be very helpful. It's increased their sorry, I can see some questions popping up. I'll answer them towards the end if that's okay. To increase their understanding, and they plan to use these materials as they head out onto their surveys. And they've enjoyed taking the quiz, and that they would take more quizzes if they were offered to them. And more generally, we found that the majority of those folk answering our questions have found that the training programme has helped them to re-engage with the scheme. That's people that were already involved with the scheme that perhaps had lost a bit of motivation. Many of them have said they want to continue accessing the online materials, and it's motivated them to get out onto their plots or even other natural environments. And also the MPMS training programme has helped them to feel connected to their volunteer community. See, the vast majority of the people we have asked would like us to continue providing digital training next year, which is a good sign, and I think good feedback for this year's. And that's on a variety of the different training contexts, but predominantly the habitat and species specific training was very popular. Just as some quick examples of other engagement and digital engagement we've been running through the season. We had an MPMS Tweet Meet virtual event on Twitter that some of you, thank you very much, were actually involved in March. This took the form of an informal Twitter conference with time slots allocated to different contributors, whether they were mentors, stakeholders, partners and volunteers, to really bring the community together across one day to learn more about the scheme. And that was actually really popular again. We got a number of new followers. It had a great following on the day. We actually had over 230,000 impressions just that month, despite it being 2 days before the lockdown announcement. So it was quite poor timing, unfortunately. But off the back of that, we do plan to run an informal, a less formal, I should say, winter 2020 tweet event, and hopefully a nice Christmas quiz for those months that are a little bit quieter for our volunteers. And we've continued to run our MPMS newsletter through the season, really to let people know what other folk have been up to during lockdown, what other volunteers have been doing, and also to celebrate 5 years of MPMS and the launch of our Understanding the Health of the Environment report that we released in spring. And our BSBI partners have also launched an MPMS playlist on YouTube, which we'd like to now use for further training videos. We've also got a whole host of other plant life examples actually that I'm happy to talk about during the workshop session, including virtual site tours and interactive webinars with posted materials in advance and even samples in some cases. So we've got a whole host of things going on at Plant Life as well as MPMS, keeping us nice and busy. So really quickly, now I just wanted to think about our lessons learned in 2020 and sort of what worked for us. And we found that overwhelmingly, we really did have a positive response to digital training during this season. And as a result, we do have plans for blended learning in 2021, even if everything went back to normal, which I think we all agree is quite unlikely. We would like to have a mixture of field training courses as well as digital training materials. Again, this could be repeats of the materials we've already provided this season for newcomers to the scheme, and also filling some training gaps that perhaps we've recognised for this season. And again, to make sure that these materials will be complementary and consistent evergreen materials, so they won't just be used for training, but they can sit along the site and they can be used by our volunteers in an accessible format to help them. We found Zoom to be a really effective and accessible platform. Our volunteers have said they found it very easy to use. They enjoyed that they just received a link and a password, and there wasn't that sort of participation barrier of potentially having to download an additional program or additional app onto their device. And also we found we tested it on a number of different devices, even mobile phones, and we found that the sessions were easy to follow on any devices. So that was a very useful learning experience. As I say, the quizzes and the opportunities to test and monitor learning was very popular, so we plan to do more of that next season. And really the building of our community feel and linking people up digitally, we'd like to continue to do that next season to make people feel a little bit more part of something and feel like there's local support. In terms of areas to develop, which is just the last thing I wanted to mention, I've said that we've had quite a bit of feedback for folk requesting video recordings of training presentations, so that's something that we would plan to do next season. Even something as simple as recording the presentation by the trainer in advance and uploading that to the website or the YouTube playlist. And that would hopefully avoid any potential technical issues with recording a Zoom session, but also thinking about GDPR implications, of course, of volunteer participation on a Zoom call. As I mentioned, we had quite a lot of the same volunteers booking multiple sessions, even if it was unlikely that all those habitat types were appropriate to them. You know, if they didn't necessarily have plots in those habitat types, and that could potentially have prevented other volunteers from getting a chance. So we've been considering ways of dealing with that next season, whether it's through limiting volunteer session numbers, so they can only sign up to a certain number of sessions relevant to their sites. We could increase participant numbers, which again would also help with those sort of inevitable no-shows that you sometimes get with training courses. Repeating popular sessions or oversubscribed sessions, as well as possibly staggering our booking release dates. We'd like to do some more interactive engagement, so including more polls and some more quizzes throughout the season and actually during each training session. That was something that folk really enjoyed and wanted more of. I think it's really to reinforce the learning. And we'd really like to see more in-field and ID videos this year, whether that's how-to guides or filling species ID video gaps. So that's what we're planning for 2021. So that's it. That's our whistle-stop, as I say, tour of what MPMS have been up to this season.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel. That was really interesting, really encouraging to hear such great feedback from volunteers and the range of things that you've been doing for the MPMS. It sounds fantastic. We did have one question for you, which I think you might have seen pop up. Sorry if I missed this, but who were the participants in virtual training and quizzes? Largely new volunteers, inexperienced existing volunteers, or most established experts? Do you have a feel for that?
Do you know, yes, it was a real divide. It was really quite equally divided. There were folk involved in the training. Of course, we only had registered volunteers permitted to the actual Zoom calls, so they were always current volunteers, but that was a real equal spread between newcomers, indicator level recorders and inventory. I personally expected to see more newcomers, but it was a real spread because I think people enjoy the opportunity to interact and talk about what they've been doing and just get a bit of a refresher and get re-engaged. So that was a real mix. In terms of the quiz, we opened that to people who weren't volunteers as well. And again, it was quarter. It was very evenly split amongst not just the surveyor level that they established as themselves, but also how many years that they've been involved in the scheme. It was a real divide.
Great, thank you very much. And we've had one other question. Did the quizzes allow you to refine the training programme, perhaps at different levels?
That's something we're thinking about doing more next season. So it was really quite a simple fun quiz this year, and we simply asked people to let us know what habitats they previously surveyed at or they're currently surveying at, so we know where they have experience. And we also asked at the end for them to let us know how they'd been doing this quiz, basically, if they'd been using our training materials as they were going through the quiz, if they were using ID guides, or if they were going it alone, just so we had a feel for what people were using to help themselves as they were going along. We did encourage people to use their guide, any guidance and any keys, for example, just as they would in the field. But of course, we didn't know that people were definitely going to do that, so we did include a question to ask folk how they went through the quiz and what materials they used.
Okay, so yeah, in this session, we're just going to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on data analysis. So did the next slide change?
Yes, it did.
Good. Cool. So like many of you, this is my breeding bird survey square, which I finally managed to get to. I think it was about the 9th of June. Once lockdown restrictions were eased here in England, also actually had further delays getting onto forestry England land, but I was obviously really delighted to get back to do my BBS square, which I've been covering this site since 1994. So yeah, it was great to be back and doing some surveying. During lockdown, many of our volunteers obviously were doing their daily exercise walk and particularly doing lots of recording from home. And I think these couple of graphs from Bird Track sort of nicely illustrate some of the impacts that lockdown had on our bird recording. So the top, this is reporting rates from Bird Track, and the top one is for red grouse. And the red line is our sort of historical reporting rate. And the green lines for this year. So obviously, look, red grouse is a bird of the uplands, and obviously those areas were pretty much out of bounds unless you live there. So it really impacted on the reporting rate for red grouse because few people were getting to those habitats. In contrast, blue tit, people were pretty much at home doing lots of recording at home, and were recording, just through observer behaviour really. The reporting rate for blue tits really shot up because people were submitting lots of complete lists with blue tit on a regular basis. In terms of our breeding bird survey, what I'm presenting here are on the right hand side the number of squares covered in 2019, then on the left squares covered in 2020. So you'll see that actually we've so far received data for about half of our BBS squares that we would normally expect to cover. And in England, actually, so far we've had about 58% of the squares returned, but that was actually much lower in Scotland, about 24% of what we received last year, 16% in Wales. So the lockdown restrictions by country also had a real impact on the number of people that could get out surveying. And the impact really was that most people missed their early visits. So a lot of our volunteers were perhaps good volunteers. So if we look at our early visits, only 31 early visits, only early visits were carried out. 1,500 late visits were carried out, but overall, not very many people. 347 squares were covered on both visits. So, yeah, normally we would expect most volunteers to undertake their early and late visits. So what we've got so far is a data set for BBS, which is about sort of half of what we would normally have, and the majority of visits were late visits only. And it's a similar story for our Waterways breeding bird survey too. We're at about half of what we would expect. Data entry is now closed. We're probably going to expect a few more paper forms coming in the next few weeks. So Hannah presented one of these graphs from Teresa from the Wetland Bird Survey earlier. So WEBS is primarily, well, operates all year round, but it's primarily a winter bird survey. So our core months are really sort of October, November through to March. So lockdown came just at a time when people were sort of managed to get in their March visits fine. And as I say, many sites do count over the whole summer too. And what we're seeing here is that in England, the number of April visits dropped. That's the light grey line on the chart, really dropped. But as soon as restrictions were eased, it bounced back pretty quickly to people resuming their counts throughout the summer months, but do anyway. Whereas in Scotland and Wales, the restrictions lasted for longer. And obviously they have the 5-mile restrictions too. So you can see the sort of longer impact of the restrictions on the counts there. So when we're thinking about what we might be able to do with the analysis for the BBS data for this year, obviously we're at a stage now that most of the data's in. We'll be starting to clean it pretty soon, and we would normally expect to have our BBS report sort of published in April. So we'd be running the trends mainly sort of December, January time. So obviously we need to look at the sample size, how many squares we've got covered, particularly the sort of a geographical bias, which I showed you there. You know, we've got a lot more squares covered in England, fewer in Scotland and Wales. So that's going to have an impact on the habitats we covered too. We do have some regional stratification already built in to our models. And also visit date bias, sort of one of the key points of breeding bird surveys, that we try to survey our squares on roughly the same date as previous years, so there's a lot of consistency. So even though restrictions were lifted across the countries, for some people their usual recording date had already passed, particularly those in southern England that record quite early for their late visits. And for me, I tend to do my late visits in sort of early June anyway, so actually I was pretty close to my sort of usual recording date, so that's something we need to look at quite closely. I was quite amused earlier that David mentioned maybe the age of volunteers could have an impact as well, because maybe some of our older volunteers were shielding, and we know that some of our older volunteers, their hearing isn't so great, and they do every year miss goldcrests, which have a really high-pitched call. So maybe we'll actually find we'll have more younger birders out doing their surveys, and perhaps proportionally more goldcrests recorded. So that's something to look into. So we have done a little bit of work so far, some preliminary analyses of the breeding bird survey data. So what we're showing here is, so the key point about BBS for our population trends is that we rely on early and late visit data for our trends. So our trends are calculated by taking the maximum counts across both visits. So what we've estimated here are population trends for species using the late visit data compared with early and late, the full data set. And what we can see here is that for 47% of the species, the difference is less than 0.05, which are the black species on the line there. And for 32% of the species, the difference is between 0.05 and 0.15. And for 23 species, the difference is greater. And we can look at that in a little bit more detail. And what we're seeing here is it helps us to identify which species are less sensitive to missing early visit data, and which species just using late visit data probably shouldn't have too much, introduce too much significant bias. So in general, many common resident species do not seem to be particularly affected by the lack of early visit data. Some of those red species, there are species like common tern, little grebe, lesser whitethroat, cormorant, goosander. So some of the scarcer species, quite dispersed species, that seem to have had the greatest impact. So yeah, the direction of change may not alter, but the magnitude of change does. So yeah, looking further at which species are most affected. So for a common resident like robin, actually just using the late data seems to have little impact and produce a fairly robust trend. But for species like tufted duck, you can see quite a significant difference here. So kind of things we're going to be thinking about in the coming weeks when we decide how to move ahead with our BBS analyses are, so actually there's potential to get some informative trends from late visits only. And we can do some more analyses around which species are most affected. But obviously the final trends we're going to really dependent on sample size, spatial bias and habitat bias. I think there's also some really important messaging for volunteers here. So we always ask for early and late visits to be carried out. This is kind of the gold standard of our BBS. So we need to think carefully about that. If we do use just the late data and we're able to produce something that's quite useful, volunteers might say, well, why do we have to do early and late visits every year? So yeah, it's really important that we do have early and late visits so we can get bigger sample sizes for most species by using that. So yeah, definitely some important messaging around what we actually do with our analyses. And I was just thinking back actually to foot and mouth from 2001, where actually we had really a blank year and volunteers didn't get out at all. And there we simply calculated the mean for 2000 and 2002 at a national level and, produced our graphs. So just sort of looking back at that, and I'm sure you had a similar approach, or perhaps you did something very different. Was this a good approach? And maybe this is something we can discuss in our breakout group a bit later. So I'll leave it there and come back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dawn.
So it's clear that we're facing challenging times at the moment, and as we've already started to discuss today, as we go forwards, we're going to have to give high attention to building resilience and making the most of new opportunities as they arise. As we've already heard from Dawn and discussed in the analytical breakout group just now, we already have some resilience built into schemes, being able to cope with some missing data through embracing analytical approaches to help us minimise the impact. And whilst funding for schemes is tight, I think this really does emphasise how valuable it can be to have some analytical capacity available that can be used to help deal with issues like that. We've also heard from Rachel and in the breakout group on engaging with volunteers through online engagement and communication technologies, that we have a certain level of resilience built into the running of the schemes through all these new communication technologies that we can use. And it can actually have extra benefits rather than just being a backup for when face-to-face engagement doesn't work. And there's been some feeling of why didn't we do this sooner with the online engagement. But in this final session, I mostly wanted to focus on some of the wider context and opportunities as we look forward. The UK seems to be at a critical moment of change, and I think this was already the case before the coronavirus crisis, but the situation with the virus has compounded the changes and added further challenges as well as potential for new opportunities. We were already facing a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis, which have been receiving greater awareness and demand for action in the last year or so. Another change is that we have left the European Union and are soon to end the transition period. A key Brexit issue impacting the environment relates to farming. The UK will no longer be under the Common Agricultural Policy and has been putting work into developing new agri-environment schemes such as England's Environmental Land Management Scheme. We now have the impacts of coronavirus and its associated serious economic and societal impacts. So there's an urgent need to manage the UK's economy as well as addressing the range of health impacts that the virus and lockdown measures are causing. So in all these changes, there's a desire to ensure a green recovery. The environment provides a vast amount of value to us, ranging from capturing carbon and regulating our climate, to filtering and storing water and preventing floods, to people engaging with nature, reducing stress levels and improving human health. There seems to be an increasing realization of the value of the environment and also of the biodiversity data and how that can inform a green recovery as we try to make effective decisions. So it's important to try and maximize the economic and social benefits when coming up with policies, but at the same time trying to minimize environmental damage. And the data that we collect from schemes can really help with that. The desire for a green recovery is across the whole of the UK. Some examples in Wales, Natural Resources Wales have set up a task force to accelerate a green recovery. And in Northern Ireland, the Environment Minister Poots set out a roadmap for green growth recovery from COVID-19. As I said, our TEPoP biodiversity monitoring schemes are going to be critical in providing biodiversity data to help inform this, as well as providing a really valuable opportunity for people to get involved and better connected with nature. So a bit more on that last point. As I mentioned in the introduction, surveys have shown that lockdown has really highlighted to many people the value of engaging with nature. And as well as surveys, there have also been scientific studies. For example, a study by Hunter et al. 2019 showed that levels of the stress hormone cortisol were significantly reduced after a 20 to 30-minute dose of exposure to nature. There have also been various government initiatives recognising the health and social benefits of engaging with nature. For example, in July, Environment Secretary George Eustice set out his vision for a green recovery from the coronavirus coronavirus pandemic in England, announcing a 4 million two-year pilot to bring green prescribing to 4 urban and rural areas that have been hardest hit by coronavirus. In Wales, the Future Generations Commissioner has also expressed interest in green prescribing. This can be seen as an invest to save opportunity. If access and opportunities to engage with nature were readily available across all of society, including to more deprived groups, then it could result in a large cost saving to the NHS in the long term in averted health costs, as well as resulting in a happier, healthier population. It's important to remember that our surveillance schemes are not just providing good data, but they're providing value merely through them running and engaging with society. There are approximately 18,000 volunteers involved in TEPoP structured surveillance schemes, and many more involved in ad hoc recording. So in recent months, there have been a range of opportunities announced across the UK to address the challenges our country is facing and promote a green recovery. So one example is the £40 million Green Recovery Challenge Fund in England for environmental charities and their partners to create green jobs in areas such as protecting species, finding nature-based solutions to tackling climate change, and connecting people with nature. This had quite a short deadline for applications, and I think the deadline for larger projects has already passed, but you've got until Friday to get smaller project applications in. Another example, the Scottish Government has set up a new substantial spending framework with a significant focus on climate commitment in a coronavirus recovery. And there's also been the work that we've been talking to many of you online about recently, with DEFRA investing resources such that JNCC can plan work to engage volunteers in our surveillance schemes from across a much broader audience than we've previously been able to reach. And we're doing that by looking at developing local application of our surveys. So my take-home messages. Firstly, I just wanted to start with an encouragement. I think we're doing a great job running our surveillance schemes as we adapt to challenging circumstances. So just want to say well done and thank you to everyone who's involved in that. Secondly, I think it's increasingly important that we make sure we fully realise and communicate the value of our schemes. This is important to ensure that others realise this and ensure that the schemes are more likely to receive the ongoing support they need in challenging economic times ahead. And finally, we should keep an eye out for new funding opportunities as they arrive. We're conscious that they often have very specific requirements, but it's worth being ready to take advantage of them as they arise and where appropriate.